Chapter 21. In the tunnels beneath Cyoria, Zorian sat cross-legged with his eyes closed, trying to sense the minds of nearby Urania with his own. That was the task he had been given by the matriarch as his first lesson, and it reminded him uncomfortably of Svim's mana sensing exercise. It wasn't going too well. That was another thing it shared with Svim's bullshit lessons. "It has only been 3 days, the disembodied voice of the matriarch admonished him. "You've barely even started. Don't be impatient. There's got to be a better way of learning this," Zorian complained. This kind of trial and error method was something he could have done without her help. As far as he could see, the only way the matriarch was really helping at the moment was by being an experienced practitioner ready to step in if something went wrong. Which, now that he thought about it, was quite valuable when messing around with something like mind magic. Or any magic, for that matter. That, and there is also the little fact that it's easier to sense and contact open minds than those of non-psychics, the matriarch remarked, fumbling a little towards the end. "I somehow doubt you would find many open individuals to practice on back on the surface. Fewer still would be willing to let you connect to them. Anyway, I realize that these initial stages are tedious and boring, but they are necessary. And if I have not explained things satisfactorily, I apologize, but I do not know how to do it any better. This ability is not something I learnt, it is something I do. Urania learn how to do this as very young children, much like human children learn how to walk and talk. Can you explain to someone who has been paralyzed all their life how to move their legs?" Zorian frowned. So he wasn't even able to master telepathic baby skills? Wonderful. Just wonderful. Taking a deep breath to calm himself, he tried to consider the task in front of him and how to solve it. Yes, the matriarch insisted he should just keep trying until he eventually succeeded by sheer weight of effort, but he was a mage, damn it. Mages did things smarter, not harder. Being psychic meant being a natural mind mage. For all that the matriarch kept bringing in her weird Urania spirituality into it, that's what it all boiled down to. A psychic could read thoughts and emotions, trawl through people's memories, hijack their senses and motor control, communicate with them telepathically and gods know what else, but all of it was mind-related. Even the matriarch admitted that Urania used modified human magic for things like her speech spell and the rest of their non-mentalist magical arsenal. Divinations were the key, he felt. If psychic powers were mind-based, why did they also enhance divinations? Not all divinations, the matriarch remarked from the sidelines, apparently following his train of thought. Only the ones that put information directly into your mind. The gift helps you interpret the results of such spells more easily, and since most high-level divinations pour at least a part of the information straight into your mind, well, you can imagine how useful that can be. Suddenly, something clicked in Zorian's mind. According to the books he read about the mind arts in the Academy library, spells that were meant to read people's thoughts were not terribly difficult in principle. The problem was that the result was totally incomprehensible to most users, unless they spent years training themselves how to interpret the results. Spells that aimed to establish telepathic communication also suffered this problem, though to a lesser extent, so long as the people in question spoke the same language, they could at least exchange verbal communication in such a fashion. In other words, human mind spells were remarkably like a divination that tried to simply dump its output into the mind of the caster, which wasn't something most mages were equipped to handle. Taking it all together, it seemed obvious to Zorian that one of the defining powers of a psychic was their ability to make sense of information entering the mind directly, whether it was other people's thoughts or something more exotic like divination results. The immediately interesting part was that it was a passive skill. Using it wasn't something he had to specifically activate, it was a state of being, so if he wanted to sense the minds of nearby Urania, perhaps he should stop trying to push his power out towards his surroundings and concentrate inward. He took a deep breath, visualized the results as motes of light around him and then just opened his mind. Blazing suns erupted all around him, including a couple in places where he hadn't expected there would be any Urania to begin with. Apparently the matriarch brought more guards with her than she had openly displayed to him. Your first success, the matriarch remarked, her telepathic probe breaking his concentration and causing the entire vision to burst like a dream. Well done. Things should go a lot faster from now on. I'd congratulate you on your fast progress, but I have to be honest and admit I have no idea how fast humans usually progress in this. Perhaps things would have gone faster if you had actually told me I was doing things wrong, Zorian said with annoyance. Why didn't you tell me I was supposed to concentrate inward instead of outward? I did, it's not my fault if you dismissed it as pointless Iranian superstition, the matriarch said airily. And I actually didn't know that the problem lay there in particular. I suppose my tendency to respond to your thoughts makes you think I can understand them in totality, yes? The truth is less impressive, I'm afraid. Telepaths like you and me labor under many of the same limitations that plague human mind magic, it's just that we advance much faster in the field and don't need a structured spell to use our abilities. Unless you structure your thoughts into actual speech, the most I get from you from my surface scans is a very fuzzy image of your current emotional state and your general intentions. This is doubly true because you're human and I'm an Urania, two radically different species that don't even share the same general body plan, much less mentality. I did, it's not my fault if you dismissed it as pointless Iranian superstition, the matriarch said airily. And I actually didn't know that the problem lay there in particular. I suppose my tendency to respond to your thoughts makes you think I can understand them in totality, yes? The truth is less impressive, I'm afraid. Telepaths like you and me labor under many of the same limitations that plague human mind magic, it's just that we advance much faster in the field and don't need a structured spell to use our abilities. Unless you structure your thoughts into actual speech, the most I get from you from my surface scans is a very fuzzy image of your current emotional state and your general intentions. This is doubly true because you're human and I'm an Urania, two radically different species that don't even share the same general body plan, much less mentality. So language and species do matter to a psychic, Zorian remarked. I was wondering about that. It's usually not a big problem, since most creatures tend to think in words when they engage in conscious thought, the matriarch said. So long as two creatures speak the same language, they can freely engage in telepathic conversation, no matter how different their underlying thoughts. If they don't share a language, well, admittedly, not all is lost. Psychics can potentially communicate with completely alien minds. It involves structuring your thoughts into general concepts that are hopefully broad enough to be understood by the recipient but not so broad as to be meaningless. Unfortunately, this method is very crude and tends to be both painful and disorienting to the target. I believe you experienced it already when you met one of the less human-savvy Uranias in one of the previous restarts. So it's not just because you're more powerful that you speak with me so easily, asked Zorian. No. I took the time to learn human language, mentality and culture. As did a number of other Urania that occasionally interact with humans. However, our web is extensive enough that most Urania can remain largely ignorant of human ways while they go on about their business, which is why most of my guards are silent around you. Trust me, they aren't usually this withdrawn, but if they tried to talk to you they'd just give you a headache. Does that mean that mental attacks are easier than communication? Zorian asked curiously. I mean, if botched telepathic communication is practically a mental assault to begin with, it shouldn't take much to simply fry a creature's brain and be done with it. It's called a mind blast, and it's the simplest telepathic attack there is, the matriarch said. It's also the simplest one to defend against. You should really stop worrying about me attacking you. Aren't the explosives you constantly carry in your pocket enough to reassure you? They help, Zorian said. But in this particular case I wasn't alluding to the possibility of hostilities between us. I was just curious. Well, good. Anyway, we should get back to developing your mind's sense before we get too off track, the matriarch said. You made your first successful stab at it, but it is far too shaky to be usable at the moment. You need to be able to sense minds around you instantly, without having to sit still with your eyes closed and preferably while doing something else entirely. Zorian sighed. He was definitely getting flashbacks to Svim on this. Asterisk asterisk asterisk. The rest of the month was fairly unremarkable and mostly spent on honing the mind's sense and trying to sense the intensity of magic sources through a mana cloud. Though the matriarch refused to teach him anything until he got his mind's sense relatively mastered, he already noticed her lessons gave him some rudimentary control over his empathy, enough that he could keep it shut with enough concentration, but not enough to focus it on specific people or otherwise refine it. That alone made the lessons useful, since it should make social events infinitely more bearable for him. And speaking of social events, Zack had been increasingly pushy about bringing him to his summer festival party. After the boy kept bugging him a few times, Zorian relented. Yes, it would bring him uncomfortably close to the other time traveler for the evening, but he was curious about how his empathy suppression would fare in a live situation and also how Zack's mansion looked from the inside. Besides, he was trying to get to know his classmates better, and this was a good opportunity to chat up some of them without looking completely out of character. Is it really okay for me to come with you? Taven asked as she walked beside him. For the last time, Taven, yes. Zack made it clear that the more people we invite along with us the better, Zorian said. Not surprising if you knew what Zack was trying to achieve. Look, if you don't want to come dash.
Oh no.
I totally do. It's not every day you get a chance to attend a party at the Novita mansion. It's just that I find it a bit strange, that's all. I'm kind of surprised you agreed to come, though. Isn't this sort of thing an anathema to you? It's either this or attending the official dance organized by the Academy, Zorian said. My only real choice is to pick my poison.
Ah.
I see, Taven nodded. I guess that in that case this does appear to be a better option. Zorian glanced at Taven from the corner of his eye, feeling slightly guilty. The truth was that his main reason for inviting her along was to personally see how she would fare against the invaders. He knew she was a lot better than him at combat magic, but probably not all that much better, and he wanted a comparison point that wasn't as ridiculous as Zack or an experienced battle mage like Kirin. Then again, this was Taven. She probably ended up fighting the invaders in every restart anyway, just not where he could see her. At least this time she would have the advantage of fighting alongside a combatant of Zack's caliber. They barely knocked on the door before Zack came along and ushered them inside. He probably knew they were coming the moment they stepped through the outer gate. Now that Zorian thought about it, it would make sense to have some kind of detection field woven into the ward scheme that protected this place. I'm glad you decided to come, Zack told him as he led them towards the dining hall, where the party was apparently supposed to take place. Considering how you behaved towards me lately, I half expected you to ignore your promise to come and stay in your room. I don't know what you're talking about, Zorian said curtly. For one thing, Zack hadn't even bothered him all that much in this particular restart. Was the other time traveler trying to bait him into unmasking himself, or had he simply spent so much time in this time loop that he was having trouble sorting events according to which time loop they happened in? What's going on here? Taven asked, looking between them uncertainly. Is there something I should know or? Zack glanced towards her before turning towards Zorian and giving him a thumbs up. New girl, huh? Man, you have a new one every time I see you. I wouldn't have pegged you as that kind of guy. What? Asked Zorian and Taven simultaneously. Zorian was honestly baffled for a moment, but then realized what Zack was mixing up his restarts again. Akoja, Ibri and Taven, Zack had seen him with all three of them in various restarts. But that was totally different. None of them were even interested in him. Zorian is a man whore? Taven asked in a worryingly calm voice. I am not. Zorian denied hotly before focusing his anger at an amused-looking Zack. And you? Stop spreading stupid rumors about me. I know for a fact you've never seen me with a girl until this evening. And you wonder why I've been avoiding you this whole month. Zack winced. Sorry, I was just messing with you. Don't worry, I'm sure your girlfriend won't leave you over a couple of stupid remarks by yours truly. Or if she does, she was never worth bothering with in the first place. Oh really? Taven said. You don't think he'd be devastated to lose a girlfriend as powerful, smart and sexy as Dash? Taven, don't you start too, sighed Zorian. Zack, she's not my girlfriend. She's just a friend. Who happens to be female, Zack said, wiggling his eyebrows. Yes, Zorian said, gnashing his teeth in irritation.
Ah.
Well, at least you already have a girl to dance with for the evening, said Zack lightly. Zorian kind of doubted that. Taven was a very attractive girl, with a nice athletic figure and the face of an angel, and she liked men who were similarly gifted in the appearance department. Chances were high that Taven would find someone else to dance with once they hit the crowd. Zack maybe, if the way she was checking out his backside was any indication. You know, this place is pretty empty, Taven whispered to Zorian as they walked. I know he's the last of his house and all, but I can't even see any servants milling around the place. Most of the servants were dismissed from service by my guardian while I was still a small child, Zack said. It did not surprise Zorian that he'd heard her. Taven was very poor at whispering. Since my parents died while I was still a baby, he had free rein to do what he felt was necessary to keep House Novita standing until I was old enough to take over. As part of that, most of the maintenance staff and other contractors were found to be unnecessary and fired. And you don't agree with his actions? Zorian guessed. He could definitely detect an undercurrent of hostility when Zack talked about his guardian, which fit in with the fact that he regularly brutalized the man at the beginning of a lot of restarts. Zack gave him a curious look before sighing. Let's just say he and I have our disagreements and leave it at that, Zack said. You know, I never did find out what happened to your family, Taven said. How come you ended up being the last of your house? Zorian punched Taven in the shoulder for asking such a question of their host, and punctuated it with a firm glare when she shot him a scandalized look. He wasn't sure what she was scandalized about, though. Did she really not realize how inappropriate her question was, or was she just surprised it was him hitting her for once instead of the usual Taven on Zorian violence? Oh, leave her alone, she's just being upfront about her curiosity, said Zack. Somehow he knew what had transpired, even though he had his back turned to them when it happened. I kind of like her attitude, to be honest. Figures, Zorian grunted. Now that he thought about it, Taven and Zack both had the same devil-may-care attitude about things, so maybe it hadn't been the best idea to have them meet each other. And with that, Zack launched into a protracted explanation of the Novita house's downfall, most of which Zorian completely ignored in favor of studying various paintings and portraits along the way. Truth be told, Zorian had already tracked down all information about Zack and House Novita that he could get his hands on, so very little of what Zack was saying was new to him. While tragic, Zack's story was by no means unique, and could be boiled down to two main causes: Splinter Wars and the Weeping. The Old Alliance was a complicated construct, a patchwork empire made out of a multitude of bickering, semi-independent states that only sometimes listened to orders coming from Eldamar, but for all its faults it was quite successful at suppressing outright warfare between its member states. Armed conflict was rare and highly limited in scale, especially since the Alliance had no major outside enemies to defend against. Thus, when the Old Alliance shattered and its component states started mobilizing their forces for war, it was the first time in nearly a century that actual war would be waged in the region. And it would be a bucket of cold water straight into the face of every battlemage in Altazia, for it would be the first time ever that firearms were used in warfare on a mass scale. Firearms were known to Altazia for centuries at this point, but they were not held in very high regard by the generals and decision-makers of Eldamar and other powerful countries. Initial attempts to make use of them had shown them to be unwieldy and almost as dangerous to the user as they were to the target. Artillery mages were a lot more mobile and effective than any cannon, and the less said about handheld firearms the better. Still, enough people remained interested in them that the technology never died and gradually improved as time went by. However, even after naval powers started arming their ships with cannons, even when a couple of mercenary groups began using rifles successfully, handheld firearms were still ultimately seen as a dead end. There was nothing that riflemen could do that a properly trained archer couldn't do better, and bows and arrows were a lot easier to enhance with magic than rifles and their ammunition. The one advantage rifles had over alternatives was that they required almost no training before they could be used effectively, and countries of the Old Alliance had no use for barely trained conscripts. Until the Splinter Wars, that is. With the dissolution of the Old Alliance, every state suddenly scrambled to arm itself for the coming conflict, and having a passable army immediately was more important than having a proper one a decade from now. Smaller countries, inherently unable to compete with the likes of Eldamar when it came to magical might, invested particularly heavily into firearms as an alternative to combat magic. Eldamar, being one of the few countries with a fully functional traditional army, felt no need to play around with these commoners' toys. No one really expected firearms to be as devastatingly effective as they ended up being. Even the countries that made heavy use of them expected them to do little except stall the advance of classical armies and perhaps motivate them to look elsewhere for easier prey. Instead, massed rifleman armies absolutely savaged traditional ones, catching established powers completely off guard. Instead of larger powers gobbling up every minor power and city-state around them and then duking it out among themselves, the outcome everyone had been expecting, the larger powers ended up weakening themselves instead, often splintering into their component parts as their internal enemies smelled weakness. Although nations eventually adapted their forces and battle doctrines to firearms technology, the damage had been done, and every subsequent Splinter War only made Altazia's political fragmentation worse. This was especially true because the Splinter Wars caused immense casualties to the mage houses that were the intellectual and political elite of Altazia's nations. The reason was simple: being a battlemage was a highly prestigious occupation and many houses used their military involvement as a way to gather influence and reputation, which they then used as leverage in furthering their political and mercantile interests. With the advent of the Splinter Wars, the demand for battle mages only increased, causing many more mages to enlist in the various armies in search for glory and wealth. This backfired spectacularly as casualties began to mount. Unfamiliar with the strengths and limitations of firearms, and often outright dismissive of them, many mages fell prey to snipers, artillery strikes and massed rifle fire. Many noble houses were thoroughly crippled by the losses they sustained, House Novita being one of them. House Novita had been fundamentally a military house, even if they were active in a lot of other fields as well. According to Zach, house leadership considered military service to build character, and every male member was expected to serve at least a few years in their youth. Quite a lot of female members enlisted as well. Very closely connected to the Eldamar royal family and very traditionalist in attitude, the Novita supported Eldamar's military ambitions wholeheartedly, conscripting every available battle-ready member into the war effort. All this meant that when Eldamar began the Splinter Wars by launching a massive, multi-pronged assault on its smaller neighbors, House Novita members were right there at the forefront of the offensive. And they paid dearly for it. Still, while House Novita was heavily diminished in the immediate aftermath of the Splinter War, they were not yet done for. Given a few more decades, the house could have recovered somewhat and reclaimed its former glory and political influence. Sadly, that's when the weeping came and ruined everything. Nobody knew where the weeping came from. It simply started to spread among the soldiers one day, a deadly, incurable disease that struck down everyone who contracted it, heedless of age, health or even magic. Once a person contracted it, their death was all but certain. They would first collapse into fever and delirium, then become blind, and then start to leak blood out of their eyes before finally expiring. Regular healers were useless, no magic could cure it, and even the church and its lost mysteries of the gods failed to halt its spread. In the end, nobody could do anything except wait for the disease to burn itself out, which it eventually did. As mysteriously as it appeared, the weeping disappeared after blazing across the entire continent. The exact number of deaths from the weeping was still debated, but most writers agreed that somewhere between 8 and 10% of Altasia's population perished in the epidemic. Some groups suffered more, while others were completely unscathed, seemingly without rhyme or reason. Zorian's family was completely untouched. For instance, both of his parents and all of his siblings survived the epidemic completely unscathed, which made them all very, very lucky. Conversely, Zack lost absolutely everyone to the weeping. The few Novita that survived the Splinter Wars all contracted the sickness and died, leaving a hollowed-out shell of a house whose only surviving member was a small child, too young to even care for himself. Which is how the whole sad story ends, finished Zack. If nothing else, the weeping finally put an end to the Splinter Wars. But that's enough of such depressing topics. We're here. Indeed they were, and boy was Zorian happy for his rudimentary control over his empathy. Zack's chosen meeting hall was a lot smaller than the Academy dancing hall, and the mood was a lot more informal and unrestrained, making crowds denser and rowdier. This would have been pure hell in his normal state. Just as he was contemplating the best way to go mingle with the other students, hopefully giving him an opportunity to dig for personal information while they chatted, the choice was taken from him. Taven also wanted to mingle, though her reasons were almost certainly more benign than his own, and she decided that the best way to do that was to have Zorian introduce her. Convenient. After talking to a couple of people he was reasonably familiar with and knew he could talk to, mostly Kale and Benesek, Zorian moved on to people that seemed like they wouldn't mind getting interrupted. Of course, in a group of this size, it was silly to expect it would only be them approaching others. "All right, who else do you know here?" Taven asked. "Well, that tall, green-haired girl having a heated argument with those two guys is Capriva Reed." "Wait, she's that Reed?" Taven asked. "One of those gangsters goes to the same class as you do?" "Why, Taven, are you suggesting that House Reed has something to do with organized crime?" Zorian asked with a small smile. "That's quite a serious accusation, you know. Nothing was ever proven, after all." "Whatever. The bottom point is that I'm not going anywhere near the gangster princess." "Anyone else?" Zorian scanned the crowd again. To be honest, he always found Capriva to be a pleasant enough person to talk to, at least in the small number of times they actually interacted. She was a bit blunt and had a habit of swearing like a sailor when things didn't go her way, but she never did anything, well, gangster-wise. A small group of girls glancing his way suddenly caught his eye. "See that group of 5 girls over there," he said to Taven. "That would be Jade, Nialu, Maya, Kiana, and Elsie." "They look giggly," said Taven with a sour expression. "Pass." "Oh, it's too late for that," said Zorian. "See how they're glancing in our direction? They've already noticed us and are debating how best to approach and interrogate us." "Zorian, don't tempt fate," Taven warned him. "It's not tempting fate, it's knowing your enemy. They just saw one of their classmates walking around with a girl they know nothing about. There is no way those 5 would let that go without investigating," said Zorian, even as the group of girls he spoke of shared a nod and marched over in their direction. "See, what did I tell you? They're already coming this way." Taven gave him a quiet groan, but then quickly schooled her face into a pleasant facade as the girls approached. Zorian understood her perfectly. he wasn't particularly looking forward to the upcoming conversation, but he knew it was coming the moment he had entered the room, so he was prepared for it. And, while he didn't really think any of those 5 was the third time traveler, he had promised to himself he wouldn't skip over any candidates without giving them at least a cursory scrutiny. This was going to be a long evening. Break. True to his prediction, once the introductions were done and the actual dancing had started, Taven found herself some tall, handsome older student and left him to find someone else on his own. Whatever, he didn't like dancing anyway. He promptly used his expert skills at avoiding attention to retreat to the periphery of the dancing throng, seeking some out-of-the-way corner where no one would bother him. He quickly noticed he wasn't the only one who had that idea. Tinami Aope seemed to have already found one such corner and was looking pretty awkward, actually. Ho-hum. Somehow he doubted she really wanted to be left alone, with a face like that. Hello, Tinami, he greeted, causing her to jerk in shock at being addressed. She fumbled. Zorian, right? That's me, confirmed Zorian. Care for a dance? Oh. But didn't you already come with a girlfriend? Won't she mind? Tinami asked. Zorian pointed towards the spot where Taven was dancing with her partner. Also, Taven is just a friend, not a girlfriend. She said, fidgeting uncomfortably. Zorian wordlessly offered his hand to her. Okay, then, she said, grabbing Zorian's offered hand with surprising forcefulness and dutifully following him onto the dance floor. In the next 30 minutes, Zorian tried to engage Tinami in conversation with only mild success, and he suspected it was only because of these highly specific circumstances she was willing to open up even a little to him. She really was a very shy girl, and he somehow doubted she was secretly the third time traveler pretending. Her awkwardness seemed quite real, and surely a time traveler as old as Zack would have grown out of that by now. So as a hobby, you raise spiders? Asked Zorian curiously. Tarantulas, she corrected insistently. But, I kind of like spiders of all sorts. I know it's weird, but... Nonsense, countered Zorian good-naturally. What could possibly be weird about a shy, delicate-looking girl breeding big, hairy arachnids the size of a human hand? Spiders are really quite amazing creatures. Though I prefer jumping spiders myself, those 2 giant eyes at the front somehow make them more human-like and relatable for me. Tinami gave him an incredulous look before frowning. You're making fun of me, she accused. Nope, Zorian countered with an easy smile. In fact, there is a particularly large colony of jumping spiders that I visit on a regular basis. It's amazing what you can learn by observing the natural world. Tinami narrowed her eyes at him and launched into a series of increasingly esoteric questions about spiders. Since Zorian had spent a great deal of time investigating various spider species as part of his research into Arania, he actually knew how to answer most of her questions. He then tried to turn the tables on her by asking her about magical varieties of larger, more monstrous varieties of spiders, gambling that her interest mainly extended to the smaller, cuddlier breeds. He gambled wrong. Not only did she know more about spider monsters than he did, she also knew a great deal about monster species that only looked like a spider, such as various kinds of spider demons, and about monsters with spider-derived traits. He wondered what would happen if he introduced her to the Arania, and decided he would definitely do so in one of the restarts. It was bound to be amusing, if nothing else. I see it didn't take you long to find a new girl once your lovely date for the evening left you, Zack said behind him, causing him to jerk in surprise. He glared at the boy in response, wondering why he didn't sense him coming. He usually always, oh, right, he'd shut off his mind for the evening so the combined feelings of the throng wouldn't overwhelm him. The fact he managed to keep it closed with no conscious effort while being absorbed into his conversation with Tinami was an encouraging sign for his developing mental abilities. "Why are you here, Zack?" Zorian sighed. "I'm the host," Zack said. "It's my job to check up on the guests and see if they're having any issues with the service and whatnot. Though in this case I just wondered if you wanted to see the fireworks or not." Oh yes, Zorian definitely wanted to see the fireworks and immediately said so. Thus, he and Tinami joined a sizable group of people in the garden where they would have an unobstructed view of the sky. Zorian paid more attention to Zack than to the sky, though. If the matriarch's plan went along as planned, Zack was bound to have an interesting reaction. Zorian had shied away from acting against the invaders, and not just because he was too weak to contribute much. The fact was that trying to sabotage the invasion was bound to get the attention of the third time traveler leading it, and Zorian didn't want to advertise his existence. So instead, he limited himself to gathering information about the invaders and waiting until he was strong enough to survive hostile attention. The Arania had no intention of doing the same. However, the invasion forces seemed to spend most of the month leading up to the invasion wiping out the Arania as a coherent force, and the matriarch had no intention of sitting on critical information for the sake of deception. Fortunately, there was no way for the invasion leaders to connect the Arania to Zorian, and the matriarch agreed with him that he shouldn't get involved, arguing that he was far too useful as a scout and memory carrier to risk revealing himself recklessly. So 3 days ago, he and the matriarch sat down to discuss a plan of action. Zorian had observed the progress of the invasion from various points in the city during the last few restarts, and he was convinced that the best and easiest way of derailing the invasion was to prevent the initial artillery barrage that preceded the invasion proper. This was especially true because he knew exactly where they were firing from. Triangulating the location of their firing positions was absolutely trivial when you were tracking a brightly shining projectile moving relatively slowly across the sky. Unfortunately, he never managed to get close to one of those firing points to see what kind of defenses they had. Since he was killed both times he attempted the feat, the matriarch agreed that assaulting those positions before they could fire was likely to be the best way to strike a critical blow to the invaders, and the plan was put in motion. The fireworks started, and not a single artillery spell accompanied them. The look of increasing bafflement on Zack's face was priceless. "What's wrong, Zack?" Zorian asked innocently. "You act like you've never seen fireworks before." "No, I mean I did, it's just, never mind," Zack sighed. Zorian shrugged and turned to Tinami, offering her a hand. "What do you think of going back inside for another dance?" Yes, she agreed enthusiastically. "Let's." Slowly, the people got tired of exploding lights in the sky and streamed back inside, leaving a frowning Zack staring alone at the sky. Break. Zorian's good mood was short-lived. While the invaders were indeed hard hit by the lack of their initial bombardment, the invasion wasn't called off, and they appeared to have made Zack's mansion one of their primary targets, probably because that's where Zack was and they were specifically targeting him. Perhaps if the students had witnessed the artillery spells hitting the city, Zack could have used that to assume control and organize some kind of proper defense, but as it was, the attack caught them all completely unprepared. Not even Zack, with all his mighty magic, could stop the flood of invaders gaining entry into the mansion, after which several groups of students were isolated from the main group containing Zack. Zorian was in one of those. He, Tinami, Taven, Briam and 4 other students he didn't know had ended up barricading themselves in one of few untouched rooms in the mansion, desperately trying to keep the invading forces at bay. The 4 unknown students were almost entirely useless, but the other 3 were worth their weight in gold. Briam had summoned his trusty fire drake to his side the moment he realized they were under attack. Taven knew how to cast some kind of incredibly destructive fire vortex that actually made the invaders reluctant to continue their attack for 10 whole minutes, and Tinami, well, She was clearly no stranger to fighting and behaved completely differently in a combat situation than she did in normal interaction. She didn't know any fire spells, but she did know how to fire some kind of purple beams that caused even the biggest of war trolls to collapse on the ground screaming. The beams did no obvious damage, so he assumed they were simply pain spells, but that was useful enough on its own. Tsunami didn't spam those beams mindlessly, instead concentrating on causing pileups, breaking up charges and interrupting enemy spellcasters. Zorian, I really hope you'll be done soon, because this position is rapidly becoming untenable, Taven shouted. Zorian ignored her, carefully inscribing the last set of explosive runes on the walls of the corridor behind them. You didn't rush this sort of task, unless you fancied blowing yourself up before the enemies even got to you. A minute later he finished the set and rose to his feet, his knees cracking painfully from the long period he spent crouching. Done, he shouted. Everyone retreat through the corridor. Just as Briam, Taven and Tsunami covered him while he set up the explosive runes, he now focused on covering them while they fled deeper into the mansion. Technically one of the unknown boys helped him in this endeavor, but he wasn't very good at it. His only offensive spell was Magic Missile and he was firing them at the war trolls charging on them, who could soak such hits easily and keep going, instead of at the robed mages supporting them, who were a lot more vulnerable and had to concentrate on spell casting. Zorian, aware that he didn't have the mana reserves to tank the entire enemy assault force, decided to take the mages out of the equation first. Thus, he raised the spell rod he smuggled into the mansion and fired a weak disintegration beam towards them. He didn't aim at the mages themselves, that wouldn't have done much, but at the floor in front of them, which had no spell resistance to protect it. The beam gouged a jagged line in the floor, sending billowing, irritating clouds of dust in the air. That should at least mess up their aiming. He then turned his attention to the rapidly approaching war trolls. There were very few tricks he could do to stop a war troll charge, and none of them could be done on a moment's notice. Thus, he decided to simply sacrifice a good portion of his mana reserves and hit them with an overpowered flamethrower. It didn't kill them, Zorian's flamethrower wasn't strong enough, and these particular war trolls seemed to be particularly tough ones, brought to deal with them after Taven cast that flaming vortex spell, but it broke their charge, and Zorian used that momentary reprieve to conjure another cloud of dust with his spell rod and fled down the corridor after the rest of the students. The other boy had broken his position and run ages ago, the useless coward, so he really hoped their confusion would last long enough for him to gain some distance. He wasn't fast enough to outrun a war troll. A furious screech erupted around him, and he could suddenly hear one of the war trolls rapidly gaining on him. Damn it, he hated dying. A sinister purple beam suddenly cut through the air next to his head, hitting the war troll behind him. The monster screeched again, this time in pain, and collapsed to the floor. Zorian gouged another line in the floor with his spell rod, cloaking the corridor in more dust, and then he was inside their newest sanctuary. Thanks, he said, breathing heavily. You're welcome, Tsunami said, fiddling with the silver amulet she was wearing and watching the dust cloud covering the corridor for any sign of movement. The amulet seemed to be the spell formula she was using to cast the purple beams. Here they come, Briam said. Remember the plan, Taven said. Let them all advance into the corridor before triggering the explosive runes. What if they notice the trap? One of the unknown girls asked. Then at least they'll be hesitant to push forward so insistently, Taven said. They didn't bother closing the door. That would just result in them being pelted by wooden splinters and shrapnel when the mages forcibly broke down the door. They had lost 2 students before they learned that lesson. Sure enough, there was a barrage of concussive beams and battering rams preceding the war troll charge. After Briam and Taven repelled the initial charge with a fairly anemic defense, the mages moved into the corridor to provide support, sensing that victory was near. That's when Zorian released a mana pulse towards the nearest cluster of explosive runes and the entire corridor collapsed in a deafening explosion. A huge plume of dust and gravel rushed into the tiny room they currently occupied, but Taven was ready and immediately created a largish bubble of clear air to stop them from choking to death. Well, Taven coughed, having been too slow to shield them from all of the dust that was obscuring the room. That should stop the attacks for a while. Still, we have a bit of a problem. This room is a dead end. The only exit is this corridor and the window to the outside. The outside is swarming with enemies, Zorian said. We don't have much choice, though, do we? Briam asked rhetorically. We can't stay here. How are we going to get down? One of the unknown girls asked. We're on the second floor, we can't just jump out of the window. All right, how many of you know how to cast the floating disc spell? Asked Taven, raising her own hand. Zorian was the only one who raised his own hand to match. Fine, that will have to do, I suppose. Okay, Zorian, I'm going to go first and get these 4 deadweights down and you follow after me with those 2. Hey, one of the deadweights complained. Sorry, but I call it like I see it, Taven said pitilessly. Let's go, before even more of these assholes converge on our position to see what the explosion was all about. And so Zorian created a large floating disc of force outside the window and jumped on it, closely followed by Briam and Tinami. At first it seemed like everything would go flawlessly, there were no enemies waiting for them at the bottom, Taven had successfully touched down, and his disc was not giving any indication of failing under the combined weight of people standing on it. Then a flock of iron beaks suddenly appeared from around the corner and Zorian swore angrily. There was really nothing he could do to deal with a flock of iron beaks, and Briam and Tinami weren't much better. There were about 50 of them, so even if he could snipe a couple off the sky it wouldn't mean a thing. Tinami probably couldn't make that pain beam of hers home in on a target, and iron beaks were very agile flyers. As for Briam, his attack options seemed to be strictly limited to his fire drake, and there was no reason for the flock to approach close enough to be caught in its fire breath when they could just rain their iron feathers on them from distance. He fired off a homing piercer anyway, and noticed out of the corner of his eye that Taven had launched a small swarm of 7 homing magic missiles. 8 iron beaks fell, but it was a drop in the bucket, and then it was the iron beaks' turn. The air in front of them blurred, and a cloud of glittering feathers was launched at them. Faced with the choice of trying to tank several hundred magical iron feathers and trying to survive a fairly dangerous fall, Zorian knew which one he wanted to chance. He immediately dismissed the floating disc and all 3 of them promptly plunged towards the ground. This would probably be the end of this particular restart. Knowing his luck, he was going to break his neck when he hit the ground, but on the bright side he managed to evade the deadly feathers. As he tumbled through the air, his eyes briefly met with those of Briam's fire drake, and he couldn't help but think it was glaring at him. It was hard to tell when that thing was angry, though, since it always looked pretty pissed off to Zorian. Suddenly, just before they were about to hit the ground, their fall was halted and they touched down on the ground as gently as a feather. Before Zorian could ask what happened, a huge swarm of flaming missiles erupted from somewhere behind him, annihilating the entire iron beak flock. You know, Zorian, Zack said behind him, sometimes I wonder if you have a death wish. How do you get yourself into these kind of situations? You're almost as bad as me. I don't know what you're talking about, mumbled Zorian, climbing to his feet and helping Briam and Tinami rise as well. Strangely enough, they didn't seem angry at him for what he'd done. Shaken by the experience, but not angry. Maybe they didn't know he dismissed the disc on purpose? Well then, I'm glad to see another group of survivors, but we should really get going, Zack said. It's not safe staying out in the open like this. Come, I know a place where we'll be reasonably safe. Zorian looked around him. A surprising number of students had survived the attack and were dutifully following after Zack. Actually, they probably survived precisely because they were following after Zack. In any case, Zorian and his group decided there was no harm in joining the group. It's not like they had a better idea anyway. They didn't get far before the attackers returned in force. Zorian heard Zack swearing something about bad luck and scoffed. This was no bad luck. The attackers were clearly tracking his movements and targeting him directly. Did Zack even take any precautions to make sure it took something more than a couple of easy divinations to track him down? Knowing Zack, probably not. But Zorian had other things to worry about, because while Zack was occupied with another flock of iron beaks, a giant brown worm erupted from the ground and started wreaking havoc right in the middle of the student throng. Zorian had only met those things 4 times so far in the various restarts, and he already hated them. They could move through earth almost as if it was water, and their hide was utterly impervious to physical force. They weren't particularly vulnerable to fire either. Zorian watched impotently as the worm single-handedly shattered student formations, sending them scattering in panic so they could be picked off one by the winter wolves circling the throng. Tinami apparently didn't want to just watch. She fired one of her purple beams at the worm and finally achieved some results. Namely, she got the worm to scream out in pain before immediately swinging its toothy maw in her direction, its murderous attention now firmly focused on her.
Uh-oh.
With a roar that promised revenge, the worm dived back into the ground. Zorian immediately closed his eyes and tried to block out the sounds of battle, focusing on his mind's sense, trying to track its movements. It wasn't too hard. Even if the worm wasn't psychic, it was the only mind that was below ground, and thus easy to pick out from all the rest. He opened his mind, keeping track of the worm's mind as it swam underground. Tinami seemed rooted to the spot, aware that she couldn't separate too far from the group lest she be picked off like the rest of the students that made that mistake, and therefore couldn't really escape the worm. Just before the worm was about to surface, Zorian wrenched Tinami to the side and dropped an explosive cube where she was just a fraction of a second before. The worm erupted from the spot only a moment afterwards, its toothy maw snapping shut around the clump of earth, as well as the explosive cube. Even as it swung its head in their direction, Zorian activated the cube and the worm shuddered and started screeching and thrashing like mad before violently vomiting some of its pulped innards. Tinami was hit by its tail as it thrashed around and was thrown to the outer periphery of the battlefield, where she lay unmoving. Zorian quickly ran up to her and was relieved to see she was still breathing and had no obvious wounds. He shifted his attention back towards the worm, hoping that it had finally died while he had not been paying attention to it. The worm swayed in the air as if drunk, and for one sweet moment Zorian thought he'd won. But then the worm swung its toothy maw straight towards him and roared out a challenge. This time it didn't bother to dive into the ground, stretching out to an impressive length far faster than a creature of such size should be able to. He didn't die. The worm stopped a hair's breadth away from his face, straining against some invisible bonds before suddenly turning to the side and biting down on the winter wolf that had been trying to sneak up on him while he was distracted. I was just in time, I see, the voice of the matriarch spoke into his mind, and then she physically appeared, jumping out of the shadow of a nearby tree like it was the most normal thing in the world. Thanks, Zorian said. But I'm not sure why you're here. I thought we agreed there should be as little contact as possible between us during the invasion. I decided that updating your memory packet with the information we found out today is more important. Zorian sighed and glanced around. Everyone was too busy fighting for their life to pay much attention to them, and it wasn't like the Urania was easy to spot in the gloom of the night. Make it quick, Zorian said, and the matriarch immediately set to work. Anything that tried to sneak up to them was dealt with by the giant worm, which was apparently still under the matriarch's control. And then, after 5 minutes, she was gone again, and Zorian picked up Tinami and tried to rejoin Zack again, but he had barely made 5 steps before a jagged red beam filled his vision, plunging his world into darkness. 22. Complications. Zorian woke up in his bed in Siren, Kiriel wishing him a good morning in that charming manner of hers. He was annoyed both at himself for not paying more attention to his surroundings and at the unknown attacker that did him in. It figured that he would survive all those close calls and near-death situations, only to get killed by a simple sneak attack. He passed the train ride sketching magic item blueprints in his notebook. Most of them were trivial things, like plates that kept the temperature of a meal constant or explosive traps that triggered on their own when certain conditions had been met, but he was toying with the idea of designing a practice dummy. He had found a combination of alteration spells that should allow him to construct a dummy out of wooden scraps and soil, but making the animation core was no simple task. And then, even if he managed that, he would have to design a warding scheme to etch into the dummy's surface, lest it disintegrate when he started hurling spells at it, possibly in an explosive manner, showering him with wooden splinters and shrapnel. He should probably also add at least a weak self-repair function, to prevent the dummy from falling apart from microfractures and such. He didn't expect to finish this project in the current restart. In any case, this time Zorian didn't wait much before contacting the Urania. Upon entering his room, he spent an hour crafting a rod of magic missiles for basic self-defense and then promptly marched off in the direction of the nearest dungeon entrance. Unlike his previous attempts to look for Urania, he wasn't simply walking around, waiting to stumble upon their scouts, he was trying to sense their minds with his brand new mind sense. Sadly, he sensed nothing except an occasional rat and... He stopped, sensing a mind of unusual strength from one of the rats ahead. He mentally ordered his floating light to intensify for a moment and was rewarded with a disquieting sight of a rat missing the top of his head. For a full second, Zorian and the cephalic rat stood still and watched one another in indecision, trying to decide on a course of action. Then, gently, hesitantly, the rat extended a telepathic probe at him, trying to worm into his mind. For one small moment, Zorian considered trying to take it on telepathically, but then discarded the thought as stupid and risky. He was completely untrained in telepathic combat, and that one rat was merely a conduit for the entire cephalic rat collective. So instead he drew his brand new spell rod and fired a magic missile at it. The moment he reached for his spell rod, the rat immediately dropped its telepathic probe and tried to run. It was too slow. The bolt of concussive force slammed into the tiny creature with a loud crack, pulverizing its bones and crushing it into paste. Well, so much for that. Zorian extended his mind sense as far as he could, trying to sense the rest of the collective, but found nothing. Either this one was an isolated scout or the rest had some method of hiding from his scans. By the time he had decided to move on, the pulped body of the cephalic rat was already being enveloped by a green, translucent mass of crawling gel. The oozes that patrolled these walled-off sections of the dungeon were artificially engineered to be less dangerous and aggressive than their wild counterparts, but Zorian was never a fan of tempting fate and did his best to sidestep the things as he moved past them. Acid burns were hard to heal, even with magic. When he finally did find the Urania, the meeting was pretty disappointing. The Urania he met was one of those that didn't know how to talk to humans, so it took him 10 minutes of telepathic pantomime that left him with a raging headache, and once the matriarch finally showed up she basically told him to get lost for a few days until she came to terms with the contents of the memory packet. Not an unexpected turn of events, but he had been hoping that the matriarch had refined her memory packet into something that could convince her past self a bit faster than last time. The matriarch was a bit pushy and conceited, but it was nice to talk to someone about the time loop. Also, the truth was that there was little he could do to unravel the mystery of the time loop without Urania help other than steadily gathering magical skills and keeping his eyes open. As he walked back to his room to sleep off his newly acquired headache, he tried to think of a way to advance faster in his magical studies. He needed a teacher. One willing to teach him spells most instructors would consider too dangerous for the likes of a freshly certified student. Who did he know that would? Oh, that just might work. Break. The next day, when Taven came to recruit him into her little sewer expedition, she found him practicing combat spells on one of the academy training grounds instead of sleeping in his room. He could have easily warded himself against her divination spells at this point, but having her track him down was part of the plan. He was hoping to recruit her as a sparring partner, and possibly teacher. He had always thought he had gotten over Taven's oblivious rejection of him, but apparently there was still some lingering resentment remaining because he noticed something very important in the previous restart. Something he should have noticed way sooner, had he not been unconsciously ignoring her and pushing her away. Taven was not at all opposed to helping him out, especially if the help was somehow related to combat. Why was he insisting on learning combat magic alone, without an instructor, when he was friends with someone who specialized in that very field of magic? So here he was, carefully casting magic missiles at the target in front of him, trying to make them as mana efficient as possible. He was hoping that Taven would offer to help on her own when she saw him practicing, and he wasn't disappointed. She did, however, attach a condition to her offer. So, in conclusion, I get a month of instruction from you, free of charge, in exchange for joining you on this sewer run of yours? Zorian asked. Yup. Taven said happily, looking very satisfied with herself. Zorian could guess why. She just found a way to pressure him into accompanying her, and all it took was promising to do something she was inclined to do anyway. I suppose that's okay, said Zorian, mentally considering how he should approach this. He could, of course, simply trail after them and let them fumble around for a while. It's what Taven expected him to do, and he was pretty sure the Arania wouldn't attack while he was present. However, after some thought, he decided to go for a different path. I have a request though. I am on speaking terms with a colony of sentient spiders living in the sewers, and I have a sneaking suspicion they're the ones that supposedly took the watch. I'd like to try actually talking to them before you go in and start burning things. Taven gave him a curious look. You are friends with a bunch of giant, sewer-dwelling spiders? Pretty much, Zorian agreed with her. He would describe the Arania as acquaintances and allies of convenience instead of friends, but she didn't have to know that. I trust you and your friends can keep that a secret? I'm sure you can see why spreading that around might cause problems for me and the spiders both. Don't worry, I'm not a tattletale, Taven said dismissively. And I've yet to see Grunt and Mumble engage in any kind of gossip, so your secret is safe with us, oh great monster charmer. You think they'll just hand us the watch if we ask? If the client's story is not made up, then yes. I don't see what use they would have for a pocket watch. But anyway, I have a request for you before you run off to do your thing. Oh. And what's that? Teach me a fire spell more destructive than flamethrower, Zorian said. How big are your mana reserves? Taven immediately asked, not at all disturbed by the request. Magnitude 12, Zorian said. A little lower than I thought, but decent enough I guess, Taven said. Zorian decided to keep quiet about the underwhelming nature of his natural reserves. What kind of spells are you looking for, anyway? Preferably something that can one-shot a troll, Zorian said. Taven looked at him like he was crazy. What? Roach, you're far too green to go around picking fights with trolls. What the hell are you on? Just humor me, Taven, Zorian sighed. Besides, this is pure self-defense, I won't be picking fights with anything. Humph, Taven shrugged. Says a guy who goes around meeting giant spiders in the sewers in his free time. But all right, I guess if you're going to do stuff like that you'll need some stronger spells under your belt. I expect an explanation about that soon, though. After the summer festival, agreed Zorian smoothly. I'll hold you to that, Taven said, poking him painfully in the chest. Now, there are two spells that kind of fit your criteria, although they will only kill a troll if you can hit the troll in the face with them, Firebolt and Incinerating Ray. The bolt can home in on the target and is cheaper in terms of mana use. The ray is far more damaging, but also far more of a mana hog, and you need to worry about your aim. Teach me both, said Zorian. The bolt seemed like something that would be more generally useful for someone like him, but he needed the raw power as well. You sure you have the shaping skills for this, Roach? Taven asked. 'Cause this kind of spell isn't going to fizzle out if you fail, it will blow up in your face. Zorian snorted derisively. Trust me, shaping skills are not something I'm lacking in, he said. He raised his arm into the air, palm pointed towards the earth, and willed some of the dust and dirt to rise towards it. The dry, loose material that covered the training ground slowly rose towards his hand in a diffuse pillar, coalescing into a rough sphere once they reached his palm. Once he was satisfied with the size of the sphere, he pointed his palm towards one of the targets and willed the mass of dirt rapidly forward, catapulting it towards the target. Sadly, the impromptu construct was too structurally unsound and disintegrated into dust halfway towards the target, so some of the effect was ruined. It didn't make the feat any less impressive to Taven, though. Damn, that was impressive as hell, Taven said. How can you do that? I don't think I could do that. Lift a rock off the ground, sure, but diffuse material like soil? That's a pretty advanced exercise. If your shaping skills are that good, I guess there are a few more spells I could teach you. Zorian smiled. This had definitely been a good idea. Break. During the next several days, while he waited for Taven to gather her team for the journey into the city's sewers, Zorian got a crash course in combat magic from his friend. Taven took a surprisingly broad approach to the topic, opting to teach him as many different spells as she could manage instead of having him practice a few until he had a firm hold over them. She claimed that he already had a core of spells he was properly proficient in, and that he needed variety and breadth of possible options more than he needed a new ace in the hole, but she later admitted she was testing him, trying to discover the limits of his shaping skills. Something she didn't end up finding, Zorian's shaping skills were better than hers. Every spell she could cast, he could as well. Not all of the spells she taught him were of the typical offensive sort he expected from her. Some of them, like the Spider Climb spell that allowed him to cling to sheer walls and other stable surfaces, Featherfall that allowed him to survive high falls, or the various comfort spells that blunted temperature extremes and other environmental conditions, could be more properly classified as survival spells. Nonetheless, Taven insisted that sometimes the environment itself was just as big of a danger to a mage as his living opponents, and that he needed to know these spells if he was going to waltz around the dungeon and similar places. She was also fairly horrified by his lack of defensive spells. Not just a lack of any defensive barriers more substantive than the basic shield, though she wasn't happy about that either. No, she was talking about wards. Wards were fairly useless once the fight started, since they were slow to cast, and few opponents would give a mage the time needed to cast them during a battle, but Taven claimed they were absolutely essential for a mage who expected to get into a fight. So long as you weren't ambushed or otherwise surprised, and actually knew you were going to be in a fight soon, you could at least cast some basic wards to improve your spell resistance and counter some of more common spells. And if you actually knew something about your opponent's spell repertoire and specialties, then you could really ruin their day with a few choice wards. This was the reason why humanity had been steadily encroaching on monster-held territory with every passing year. Most magical creatures only had a handful of inborn magical tricks and abilities on their side, and once you knew what they were you could devise a perfect counter for them in advance. Unfortunately, you could only stack so many wards on top of each other before they started to interfere with each other and the whole edifice collapsed, and some of them inherently interfered with each other's operation, so knowing how to combine them effectively was a bit of a specialist skill. Taven was not very proficient with wards herself, being more offensively focused, so he would need to find somebody else for anything except the basics. However, most of the spells she taught him were various offensive and defensive energy projections, largely ones revolving around fire and force, but also some spells based on cold and electricity. Among other things, Zorian could now cast the ever-famous Fireball spell, exactly twice before he ran out of mana. So not very useful, honestly, but Taven claimed that any mage worth their name should be able to cast a fireball, and that the utility of such spells would naturally increase along with his mana reserves. Actually, I'm curious, is there some way to speed up the growth of mana reserves? Asked Zorian. I know that artificially increasing them has bad side effects, but is there some kind of training method that would speed up natural growth? Taven looked at him, looking apprehensive. Technically, yes, admitted Taven reluctantly. It's as simple as using mana-intensive spells to constantly exhaust your reserves. It would kick the growth of your reserves into overdrive. However, that kind of unnatural growth would completely wreck your current shaping skills. Your normal growth of reserves is so slow because your soul is making sure your control over mana doesn't slip. Wrecking your shaping skills just to speed up the growth of your reserves is really short-sighted, Roach. Please don't do it. I never would, and you know I'm not exactly the most responsible girl. Surely you can wait for a few years for them to grow on their own? Well, he certainly wasn't pressed for time at the moment, Zorian had to admit. I suppose that makes sense, he said. I guess the reason why mana reserves plateau after a while is that there is only so much power a soul can safely handle. Increasing the cap artificially after that point messes up the mage's shaping skills with no hope of ever regaining them. No wonder everyone recommends against doing it. No matter how benign the enhancement process, the result is still more power and less control over it. There is always a trade-off between control and power, said Taven. It's just not apparent most of the time, since very few people try to develop their shaping skills to their limits. Many mages think that having more mana is always better, since you can always work harder on your shaping skills, but increasing your mana reserves without bad side effects is essentially impossible. It's not true, though. No matter how much time they spend honing their shaping skills, people with huge mana reserves are outright incapable of performing some particularly finesse-focused spells, things like advanced mind magic, detailed illusions, and complex alteration constructs. Wait, you're saying that I'll lose the ability to cast finesse-based spells as my mana reserves increase? Asked Zorian in alarm. No, I'm talking about your natural mana reserves, your inborn capacity before you start to increase it through regular spell casting. About magnitude. Most spells, even highly sophisticated ones, are designed for average mages, magnitude 8 to 12, in other words. You're 12, so still comfortably within the intended range. Hell, I've heard of one particular 15 magnitude mage that became a damn good illusionist, so even if you tip over a little it will hardly matter. Considering Zorian's real magnitude was 8, he apparently had nothing to worry about. Still, it did make him wonder about Zack, who seemed to have magnitude in the low 60s. How did that kind of monstrous power factor in Taven's scheme? How about people with really high magnitude? Asked Zorian. How high can you go before finesse-based spells become impossible? I've never seen hard numbers, but I'd guess around magnitude 20 or so, Taven shrugged. How about the really high numbers? Zorian asked. Something like magnitude 60? Taven blinked, seemingly baffled by the question. Well, that would be downright inhuman, she said finally. Is that even possible? Anyway, I'm not sure whether that would even be a good thing, even for a battle mage like me. Anyone with such mana reserves would have to spend years longer than their peers just to gain a basic level of proficiency expected of a certified mage. Maybe as much as a decade even, I don't know. Zorian thought about what a relative failure Zack was before the time loop and frowned. He had thought that Zack had simply been a lazy slacker, but maybe there was more to it than that? Then again, he had a feeling Zack was a special case. Those inhuman mana reserves were just that, completely outside the human range. He found absolutely no records of people like that in any of the books, and most of the experts he asked flat out told him such people didn't exist outside of myths. Also, while Zack had been a crappy mage, he did succeed in getting certified, so his huge mana reserves clearly weren't as crippling as they should have been. Maybe it was a Novita house bloodline? One that gave their family huge reserves without the crippling loss of control, perhaps. Of course, the Novita publicly claimed they had no bloodline, but it wouldn't be the first time a house had lied. I hesitate to even bring this up, Taven said, breaking him out of his thoughts, but if you're really desperate for a short-term mana boost, you can always absorb ambient mana faster than you can assimilate it. I'm sure you're aware of the drawbacks, though. Zorian nodded. There were two main forms of mana available to the mage, his personal mana and the ambient one that emanated from the underworld. Personal mana was something that all things with a soul possessed in varying amounts, and it was attuned to the person producing it. It bent easily to its creator's will, and was innately more malleable and controllable than anything else they might use to power their magic, since it never resisted the caster's efforts to shape it. Ambient mana, on the other hand, was both harder to control and toxic to living beings. Not enough to kill a mage just for using it once, but any substantial, prolonged use resulted in sickness and insanity. The mages of old believed that ambient mana was tainted by the world dragon's hate for humanity and shunned its use, but modern mages had discovered a few tricks to making use of it. One was by using it to power items, which had no minds to corrupt or bodies to sicken. The other was to assimilate the ambient mana into their personal reserves, negating its toxic properties. While the process of assimilation was too slow to power actual spells, being able to regenerate personal reserves faster was useful enough that the skill spread far and wide. These days, every student of magic was taught how to do it along with the other basics of spell casting. I'll get sick, Zorian said. And possibly mad, if I keep using it constantly. Right, Taven said. Using raw mana on a regular basis is pretty stupid, but if you're in a real bind, well, it's better to spend a few days bedridden with a fever than end up dead. You've used it before, guessed Zorian. Taven gave him a surprised look, like it was unexpected he figured it out. Maybe once? Or twice? She shifted her stance, looking uncomfortable. But keep quiet about that, will you? Most combat mages have done it a couple of times in their life, but guild inspectors don't accept everybody's doing it as an excuse. Zorian made a gesture over his mouth, indicating that his lips are sealed. It's not like she didn't know plenty of things to get him in trouble with, anyway. Let's just get back to the lesson, oh great teacher, Zorian said. Since you're so intent on teaching me mana-intensive fire spells, how about that fire vortex I heard you can cast? When the time came, Taven and her two friends let Zorian take point as he led them towards Arania territory. They had already tried and failed to divine the location of the watch, which wasn't terribly unusual if it really was taken by the Arania. The Arania had been engaged in a shadow war with the invaders for a while now, even before the time loop started, and their anti-divination wards were top-notch. We meet again, Zorian Kaczynski, the matriarch spoke telepathically to him. She was surrounded by 6 honor guards, though only 2 were actually visible while the other 4 hung from the ceiling while under some kind of invisibility spell. Zorian only knew they were there because he could sense their minds. And once again you bring additional guests with you. 3 of them this time. If this pattern continues, we'll have to find a more spacious area to house them all after a few more restarts. Funny, Zorian sent back. But actually, this is the group I was a part of when I first met the Arania. We were looking for a watch supposedly in your possession then, same as we are now. Sounds familiar. What's going on? Asked Taven. She and her 2 friends were hanging in the back, looking apprehensively at the 3 spiders in front of them. Why are you just staring at them? Before Zorian could say anything, the matriarch started waving her front 4 legs in the air for a while and then spoke. What's this about a watch I hear? she asked, turning her two biggest, forward-facing eyes at Taven. It took a few minutes of explaining and clarifications, but in the end the matriarch finally seemed to remember the event in question. "Oh, now I remember," she said. Though the man in question certainly wasn't any kind of innocent passerby, and the watch is no simple timekeeping device, he had assaulted our web with a couple of other thugs and ended up dropping his bauble when we chased them off. "He's one of the invaders," the matriarch told him telepathically, so only he could hear. "Or at least he works for them." "You say you saw him? Excellent, we finally have an entry point into the organization. A face, a name and face-to-face contact should be enough to divine where he lives. You know his name, don't you?" "Excellent. Hopefully he gave away his real one." "Did you shake hands with him when you accepted the job?" "No." "Try to shake hands with him when you give him the device. Maybe put a tracking spell on it if you know how." Somehow, the matriarch was able to participate in two separate conversations at once, speaking out loud to Taven and her two friends as she spoke telepathically to Zorian. Zorian himself was not similarly blessed, and mostly tuned out her explanation to Taven in order to absorb what she was telling him mentally. Finally, she seemed to realize this and cut her telepathic communication with him short, allowing him to pay attention to what she had been saying to Taven. "So I'm not sure what the device is for, but it's clearly a magical item of some sort," the matriarch said out loud. "It's useless for us Arania, but we are well familiar with the concept of trade. We were hoping to trade it to some of our human contacts for something we can actually use, but since it's our dear friend Zorian that's asking for it, I guess we'll give it to you as a favor. I'm sure Zorian will make it up to us, eventually." Fumbled Taven, looking at him uncertainly. "Is that okay, Roach? Are you?"
Yeah.
"I'm fine with that," Zorian shrugged. Although as far as he was concerned he didn't really owe any favors to the matriarch for this. "I only said that for appearance's sake," the matriarch told him telepathically. "It would be weird if we just gave it up for no reason. Besides, as far as I'm concerned, you will repay my generosity by helping me track down your employer so we can ring him for information." "Fong of Victory will go and retrieve the bauble," the matriarch said out loud, causing one of the two visible honor guards to suddenly skitter off into the darkness. "I'd ask you to warn your employer against further aggression against us, but it's probably best if you keep quiet about talking to us." "Why did he attack you anyway?" asked Taven. "You seem nice enough to me." "Most places will kill sentient monsters as a matter of course, if they find them within their borders," Grunt said. He and Mumble were both pretty quiet thus far, so it was a bit startling to hear him speak up all of the sudden. Taven gave him a dirty look for his remark. "What?" "I'm just saying he didn't need a reason. Their presence would be offense enough for some people." "It's a little more complex than that," the matriarch said. "Humans clash with other sentient races, that is true, but that's because most of them are highly territorial, murderous, view humans as food, or all three. On occasions where that wasn't the case, humans have shown themselves willing to make exceptions and take a more nuanced approach. There are several dragons that deal with humans in a peaceful manner. The lizard men of Blantyre have long been a trading partner for human nations, and many of the splinter states bordering the wilderness have made secret or not-so-secret pacts with various spirits and monster clans living within their nominal borders." "You've thought about this a lot," Zorian remarked. "Though not well known, we have been peacefully interacting with humanity for quite a long time now," the matriarch said. "The Arania have been living in the deeper levels of the dungeon for as long as this city has existed. When the foundations were being laid, several campaigns were launched into the local sections of the dungeon to clear out the threats lurking inside it. However, this power vacuum also allowed weaker races like Arania to move into the place. The dungeon around the hole is prime real estate for magical creatures of all breeds, as you probably know, and the competition was fierce. Fortunately, while we Urania lacked the brute strength or destructive magical abilities of some of our competitors, we were far more willing to cooperate with humans to our mutual benefit. We contacted some of the humans that were willing to cooperate with us and gave them information about our mutual enemies, their strengths and weaknesses, where they lived, the timing of their attacks and movements, everything they needed to wipe them out, or at least weaken them to the point where we could finish the job. Information gathering has always been our specialty. Zorian found himself fascinated by the story, and more than a little surprised that the matriarch was willing to say all this in front of Taven and her friends. Then again, Zorian never told them that Urania were mind readers, so their minds were completely unshielded. The matriarch probably had a pretty good picture of how likely they were to cause trouble for her. And they weren't going to remember anything about this when this loop ended, either. Although giving information to humans helped us as well as them, we rarely did it for free. In return for our secrets, we demanded some of your own. Our human allies used the information we provided to make a name for themselves and further their careers, and in return they taught us some of your magic and helped us adapt it for our own use. Armed with our very own system of structured magic, the Urania grew in strength and versatility, solidifying their hold over this region and making the web that lived beneath Cyoria the most prestigious of Uranian webs. The resulting prosperity caused their numbers to swell, and they sent a never-ending stream of colonists and breakaway webs to the surrounding region, where they proceeded to evict or subjugate every lesser Uranian web they encountered. But although these Urania left Cyoria in search of their own destiny, no place had the prestige or opportunities that Cyoria offered, and thus viewed their mother web with envy and resentment. Soon, a number of these breakaways banded together and, armed with the experience of fighting the lesser webs for territory, drove the original web out of their homeland. It would not be the last time Cyoria changed hands. The conquerors were soon evicted by another group of invaders, and this group was evicted by another, and then they were evicted by us. We are the fifth web to hold this place, and while our position is secure at the moment, any sort of weakness could cause the neighboring webs to get restless. Huh, Zorian said. So if you were, hypothetically speaking, absolutely decimated by someone and had your numbers severely reduced? Our neighbors would launch a few probing raids at the very least, the matriarch said. But anyway, my point is that humans and Urania are not, nor have they ever been enemies. Well, barring some isolated incidents. On both sides. In fact, it has been my explicit policy to encourage closer links between this web and humans living in Cyoria. I hope the day will come when Urania will be able to walk the street above in open daylight, just like any other citizen. And I suppose you hope the humans will defend you from outside threats, like any other citizens, Grunt said. Like, say, from those rival webs that want to take your territory? I confess that possibility does factor rather heavily into my thinking, the matriarch admitted. The city authorities would be a lot less inclined to stand by and watch if we had an established, formal relationship with them. So is this your recruiting pitch? Asked Taven. Are you trying to turn us into your agents? More contacts is always good, the matriarch said. But no, I'm not trying to recruit you. I just sensed you were worried about Zorian's association with us and wanted to assuage your fears somewhat. Anyway, Fong of Victory is coming back with the bauble, so we'll have to cut this short here. Talk to Zorian if you ever want to chat with us again. Sure enough, the matriarch honor guard soon returned with the watch. Zorian half expected her to return with the watch gripped in her fangs, but it actually came back carrying some kind of leather harness full of pouches across its body, one of which held the watch. For a moment Zorian wondered how they made that, what with them lacking hands and all, but then realized he was being a bit foolish. The matriarch had already said they traded with humans for a lot of things, this must be one of them. They quickly said
Goodbye
to the Urania and were on their way back to their employer, prize in hand. I don't know what to think, Taven said when they put some distance between themselves and the Urania. They seemed nice enough, but it's a bit disquieting to find out we have an entire colony of these things living beneath the city, pulling their strings over gods know how many people.
Yeah.
Agreed Mumble quietly. Zorian could definitely see why Taven called him the way she did. He tended to talk really softly, making his speech very hard to understand sometimes. Did you know Cyoria is kind of famous for its spider silk? The merchants who sell it are really cagey about where they get it in such quantities and have declared their source a trade secret. Most people think they have managed to create a spider species that can be farmed effectively and have a giant farm hidden somewhere, but I think it's pretty obvious now where they get it. Zorian mostly kept out of the conversation, alternating between listening to their conversation, when they were saying something interesting, and studying the device they retrieved from the Urania, when they weren't. It was, as the matriarch said, a magical item of some sort, shaped like a pocket watch, but not one. The hands didn't move, and the screw that should have allowed a person to wind it was fused with the casing and seemed to be simply an ornamental bump put there to make the illusion superficially convincing. He tried to channel mana into it, but that didn't result in anything substantial. The device probably required the user to channel mana in a very specific manner. Many complex magical items did. The lessons in divining the secrets of magical items that Haslush gave him really paid off here. Considering its purpose, the device yielded its purpose surprisingly easily. To put it bluntly, it was equipment for burglary. More specifically, it was a ward scanner, designed to guide and enhance divination spells meant to seek out weaknesses in complicated warding schemes so they could be broken or bypassed more easily. Their employer had probably been trying to identify a hole in Iranian defenses. Still, while the purpose of the device was readily apparent to his divination spells, its method of operation stubbornly remained a mystery. After several unsuccessful attempts to pry the casing open without damaging the device, he finally decided to try something experimental. He extruded a mana cloud from his hands, the way he did when picking locks, and directed it to trickle into the device's insides through the gaps and misaligned seams. The resulting information was fuzzy, but told him that the insides were filled with brass gears and crystals. They were probably not meant to be pried open. How then? Ah, so that was the trick. The hands of the clock weren't just static, they were nothing more than an image painted over a glass cover. Zorian pressed his finger against the glass cover and pushed it into the casing. There was a soft click from the inside, and when Zorian released the pressure, the cover immediately flew open, revealing a complicated interface full of dials and sigils. Very complicated interface. He wasn't going to figure this out in the hour or so they had until they reached the client. He was so taking this thing apart to see how it worked in one of the future restarts. Break. Finishing the job was done without complications. Zorian opted not to put a tracking spell on the device, since he didn't know how sensitive the device was and didn't want to ruin it. That turned out to be a good choice, as the man immediately cast several diagnostic spells on the device once Zorian handed it over, one of which Zorian knew to be a spell designed to detect simple tracking spells. Once the transaction was done, Zorian insisted they shake hands, claiming it was traditional in his village to do so after a successful business deal. The man rolled his eyes and mumbled something about yokels, but humored him anyway. Mission accomplished. After they all shared a drink in a nearby tavern, Taven insisted and wouldn't hear no from anyone. The group separated. Zorian immediately descended to the sewers again and went back to the Urania. A ward reader, you say? The matriarch asked. It makes sense. He and his friends had been hanging out at the edge of our territory for a while, trying to stay hidden. I'm surprised he hired a bunch of students to get it, though.
Yeah.
I'm not sure what he was thinking, Zorian said. Seems like a stupid idea to me. We'll find out in a few days, if all goes well, the matriarch said. That said, there are other things we must discuss. I believe I told you in the previous restart that I happened upon some pretty important information. You did, Zorian agreed. I was wondering what that was about. It's about the invaders. First of all, your guess was right, they are indeed from Ulquinabesa. I knew it, Zorian scowled. What was it? Are they out for revenge or is this just sheer opportunism? A bit of both, the matriarch said. They resent you for their exile and they think you're weak, now that the Splinter Wars and the Weeping wiped out most of your battle mages. But that's not the important part. The important part concerns a question so basic I'm honestly not sure why neither of us thought of it. Namely, why exactly did the invasion think they could conquer Cyoria in the first place? Zorian opened his mouth to answer with the aid of the time loop.
Duh.
But then quickly closed it again. According to the matriarch, this invasion had been in the works far before the start of the time loop. Clearly, someone associated with the invasion got brought into the time loop eventually and started feeding information to them to make the whole endeavor scarily effective, but what about before that? Without knowing exact locations of Cyoria's defenses, their initial bombardment would have been a lot less damaging than it was. Without knowing the Academy's exact ward scheme and how to bypass it, their assault at the place would be practically doomed from the start. And on top of all that, the matriarch claimed the Urania were successfully keeping the invaders out of Cyoria's underworld before the time loop. So really, the invasion never really had the chance to take control of the place. Perhaps they didn't, Zorian said. Intend to conquer it, I mean. Cyoria is pretty important to Eldamar, but it's not the capital, nor its industrial heartland. It's the seat of Eldamar's Mage Guild and the home of the world's most prestigious Mage Academy, neither of which is likely to cooperate with the invaders. Most likely, they just intended to do as much damage as possible. Keep Eldamar's magical might busy while they invade with the bulk of their forces elsewhere. You're very close, the matriarch said. They were indeed trying to cause as much damage to the city as possible, but it was to be much more than a simple distraction. Apparently, the date of the summer festival is very magically significant. It is the day of the year when the barriers between planes of existence are the weakest. In fact, the weakening starts exactly 1 month before the date, gradually reaching its peak on the day of the festival. And this year's summer festival is even more special than usual. I'm afraid that us Urania don't know much about astronomy, seeing as we live largely underground, but apparently this year's summer festival includes some kind of planetary alignment? Zorian took a deep breath, a shiver running down his spine. Of course! How could he have missed it till now? This year's planar alignment, signified by several planets aligning with their own, an event that took place once every 400 years or so. The last time such an event happened, a city of mages took advantage of it to teleport their entire city all the way from Mycena to the southern coast of Altazia, performing the largest feat of transcontinental teleportation to ever be recorded. If someone wanted to mess around with space and time on a grand scale, this was the time to do it.
Yeah.
That would explain a lot, Zorian finally said. Like why the time loop was initiated now, of all times. But wait, how does that help them to do more damage to the city? Did they intend to teleport the city into the sea or something? No. First of all, they intended to summon a large amount of high-level demons to help with the invasion. This was why they were willing to go through with the attack, despite their lack of success against us and their inability to do much to the Academy and its wards. Demons, especially high-level ones, are virtually immune to mental attacks and highly resistant to magic. The Urania would be massacred in no time at all, and the mages would be too busy fighting for their lives to help out the city's mundane defenders. Those same defenders would be up against trolls and fire elementals, who are immune to firearms, with winter wolves and iron beaks acting as support. That's horrible, Zorian said after digesting that for a second. Why aren't they doing that now? They can't, remember? No summoning anything while in the time loop. The whole material plane has been cut off from the spiritual ones, the matriarch reminded him. Oh.
Yeah.
Zorian said. I guess that would throw a serious wrench in the works. I wonder if they actually went through with the invasion during the initial restart when they had no agent inside the time loop. They would have surely known their plan was doomed without demonic support. They probably would, the matriarch said. The demons were ultimately a distraction, same as the rest of their forces. The invasion leadership didn't actually think they were enough to do more than cripple Cyoria, and they wanted it completely wiped off the map. No, the real target lies with the area around the hole. While the defenders were busy fighting for their lives, a group of mages would secure the place and enact a grand summoning ritual.
Ugh.
Zorian grunted. Let me guess, a really big demon. No. They wanted to summon a primordial. Color instantly drained out of Zorian's face. What? But that would leave the whole city a lifeless crater. What about their own forces? Expendable, the matriarch told him bluntly. Everyone high enough to matter was ready to teleport away at the first hint that the summoning was successful. The rest were disposable pawns that were never actually expected to survive. Besides, you'll notice that the actual invasion force is really light on human mages. Only a minimum of Abasan mages was necessary to maintain some control over the various demons and monsters. And you're actually rather optimistic in your damage predictions. The Abasan leadership hoped that being summoned with the help of the biggest mana well on the continent would give the primordial enough power to linger on this plane for weeks. If so, it would rampage across large swathes of Altazia before finally running out of power, or until the Altazians managed to organize a group of mages big enough to banish it back to its realm. Then Ulquin Abasa could just swoop in once it's gone and mop up the demoralized survivors. Zorian was honestly at a loss for words. On one hand, the plan was utterly crazy, and a large part of him wanted to say it would never work. Where did they even find a ritual to summon a goddamn primordial of all things? But still, he'd watched the invaders bulldoze through Cyoria's defenses far too many times to discount them like that. If they thought the plan could work, it probably could. Where did they find mages willing to do the summoning? Zorian asked. They must have known they'd be killed by the primordial's rampage before they can escape, being so close to it and all. And do you happen to know which primordial it was? The summoning would be done by the esoteric order of the Celestial Dragon, probably known to you by the name, Cult of the World Dragon. Apparently they are fully willing to die in order to summon one of the Great Mother's children. Those of their members not involved with the summoning are helping the invasion forces as regular mage support or simple saboteurs, in case of more mundane members. Actually, now that I think about it, they are probably acting as the invaders' inside agents in general. We'll have to infiltrate their group deeper for more information. Anyway, no, I don't know which primordial. Just that it was one of the landbound ones. The Abasans didn't want to risk it suddenly deciding it wanted to visit their little island and flying over. I'll bet, Zorian said. Of course, all this means we have a problem on our hands. No matter how formidable the invasion is while we're trapped inside the time loop, it will be even more fearsome outside of it. They will have additional demon support on top of everything they already have, and we'll have to spend some of our time thwarting the primordial summoning. I want to say those cultists are just totally crazy and couldn't summon a crippled imp, much less a thrice-damned primordial, but the possibility is just so catastrophic we can't afford to risk it. Yes, this indeed complicates the matter considerably, the matriarch agreed. My original plan was to keep thwarting the flow of the invasion until the third time traveler is forced to reveal themselves either through sloppiness or frustration, lure them into an ambush and mind-rape them into catatonia, find a perfect counter for an invasion over several restarts, and finally, find a way to break the time loop and deal with the invaders for real. The part about dealing with the third time traveler still seems workable, but finding a perfect counter will clearly be impossible with such a large variable missing while we're inside the time loop. Zorian was a tad queasy about how matter-of-factly the matriarch spoke of destroying a person's mind, but he had to admit he knew of no other way to deal with the third time traveler. The only other way involved destroying his soul, and that was arguably even more morally reprehensible. Plus, he didn't actually know how to destroy someone's soul. And hopefully never would. Right? Zorian sighed tiredly. What a day. Do you have any other bombshells to throw at me? Well, not as such, no. However, these recent developments mean that I will not have much time to teach you this month. Fortunately, you are at the level where you don't really need a high-level user like me to guide you, so I have found you a suitable replacement. Zorian, say hello to enthusiastic seeker of novelty. One of the Arania that had accompanied the matriarch, a rather small and twitchy individual that seemed to have trouble staying still, suddenly jumped down from the ceiling and landed in front of him. Hi. I am enthusiastic seeker of novelty and I will totally be your teacher this month. I know you humans have trouble with our names, so you can just call me Novelty. I don't mind. She circled around him as she spoke to him telepathically, looking like some kind of weird puppy inviting him to play with her. Anyway, when the matriarch asked for volunteers to teach you, I was like, this is your chance, Novelty. I was totally game. They won't let me help with defense because I'm supposedly too young, but they told me you're a baby at this psychic stuff and I can totally take care of babies. And hey, you can teach me stuff too. I was always curious about you humans, like how you can walk on your hind legs without tipping over all the time or... Zorian tuned out her chatter in favor of giving the matriarch a glare. Does she come with an off button? He asked telepathically. The matriarch simply projected a mixture of amusement and satisfaction in response.